John Marshall sat comfortably in a luxurious leather chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The pale yellow lights of the lavish party reflected on his sharp face, creating a cold but attractive line. Around him were prestigious guests, successful businessmen and movie stars immersed in lively conversations. This is John's world, a world where money is power and winning is inevitable. He doesn't believe in losing, and he never takes a gamble without a worthy reward. But tonight, something different is happening. Jack, one of his old friends, shot him a challenging look from across the bar. In Jack's hand was a glass of champagne, a drink that carried the arrogance of the upper class. He took a sip, then smiled mischievously. "You think you're invincible, don't you, John?" Jack tilted his head, his voice full of meaning. John smirked, his sharp eyes sweeping over his friend. "What do you mean?" Jack put down his glass and leaned forward as if preparing to make a tricky move. "You always win at everything: business, sports, women. But I bet there's one thing you don't dare do." John smiled faintly, the smile of someone who always controlled the game. "Tell me." Jack looked around slowly, as if choosing his words perfectly. Then, he smiled and said, "I bet you wouldn't dare marry a woman who isn't your ideal type." John was silent for a moment, but his eyes flashed with amusement. This wasn't the first time Jack had tried to challenge him, but this time seemed more interesting than the previous ones. "Who are you talking about?" "A woman who doesn't fit your beauty standards. Not the ones with long legs, hot bodies, or from prestigious families. I want to see if you dare to bet on someone completely different." John tapped his fingers lightly on the rim of his glass, a habit he had when he was thinking. The idea sounded strange, but it aroused his conquering instincts. "And the reward?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Jack laughed, raising his glass as if to raise the game. $1 million. You must marry her and maintain the marriage for at least 6 months. John leaned back in his chair, his fingers lightly tapping the rim of his whiskey glass. $1 million wasn't a lot of money to him, but the stakes weren't about the money. They were about honor, about defiance. And more importantly, they were a game he was sure he could win. "Okay, I agree." Jack laughed loudly, as if he had been expecting this answer. "Good. Then let me introduce you to Chloe Richards." Little did John know that this decision would change his life. John Marshall had never let anyone dictate his game. He had always been the one who made the rules and determined the outcome. But as he walked into the fancy restaurant to meet Chloe Richards, a part of him began to feel uneasy. Not out of fear of losing, that had never been in his vocabulary, but out of curiosity. He had read her profile. Chloe Richards, 28, was an independent consultant. Not one of the wealthy or celebrity types John usually associated with. She didn't fit his physical standards, no model with long legs or a sharp, seductive face. But what he had read intrigued him. She was smart, independent, and didn't seem like she was going to be easily defeated. As the restaurant door opened, John's eyes quickly recognized the woman he had come to see. Chloe Richards walked in, not the least bit shy. She wore a simple yet elegant dark blue dress, neither showing off nor hiding anything. Her hair was lightly curled, falling naturally over her shoulders. She wasn't the type of person John would normally look at, but there was something about her that made him unable to look away. Chloe approached the table without the waiter leading her way. Her eyes met John's, without any shyness or impression. Unlike other women who were always trying to impress him, Chloe was simply calm. John stood up, smiling politely. "Are you Chloe Richards?" Chloe nodded, pulling out a chair before John could pull it out for her. It was a small gesture, but enough for him to realize she wasn't the type of woman to be easily conquered. "And you're John Marshall," she said, her eyes studying him unabashedly. John smiled slightly. "I guess Jack told you about the bet." "Sure," Chloe replied, her voice devoid of emotion. She picked up the menu, flipping through the pages without really caring. John leaned back in his chair, waiting for her to continue. When Chloe put the menu down, she looked straight at him, her voice clear and unambiguous. "I'm not the type to be easily manipulated. You may think this is a game, But if we're going to do this, I have my own rules. John raised an eyebrow, amused. He had expected some hesitation, perhaps surprise or apprehension. But no, she was laying down conditions with him. Interesting. I'm listening. Chloe crossed her arms, her eyes determined. First, I don't care about your money. 6 months is 6 months, no more. No less. After that time, I go my way, you go yours. John nodded. That was no problem. Second, I'm not a decoration. I have a job, I have a life. And I have no intention of changing them just because you're a millionaire who wants to control everything. For the first time in his life, John felt like someone had seen through him from the moment they first met. She knew what kind of man he was, and she had no intention of letting him control this game. Fair. John took a sip of his drink. Then why did you agree? Chloe was silent for a few seconds, as if considering whether to tell the truth or not. Finally, she let out a small sigh. Perhaps I also want to prove something. I want to see if a person like you can endure a marriage without power in your hands. John laughed, a low but amused laugh. A bet within a bet? I'm starting to like it. Chloe didn't smile. She simply picked up her glass of water and took a sip. We'll see who wins, John Marshall. At that moment, John realized one thing. This was not going to be an easy game as he had thought. After the meeting, John drove back to his penthouse. His mind was still filled with thoughts of Chloe. She wasn't the type of woman he could easily seduce or manipulate. She wasn't impressed by his wealth or status, and she had set boundaries right from the start. That excites him. John didn't like losing, and this time, he felt like he was entering a different battle than any other. He picked up the phone and called Jack. I met her. And? You're backing out? Jack chuckled triumphantly over the phone. John narrowed his eyes. The feeling of being challenged only made him more determined. No, I'll play to the end. Jack laughed. His voice filled with amusement. Well then, good luck, my friend. I have a feeling you won't have an easy victory this time. John hung up the phone and stood by the large window, looking down at the brightly lit city. He didn't know why he had a strange feeling in his heart, not fear, but a new excitement. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he had the upper hand. And that's what makes him unable to stop thinking about Chloe Richards. John Marshall never thought marriage could be a battle. But the moment Chloe Richards walked into his life, he knew it was more than just a bet. The wedding was a quiet affair with no elaborate reception or emotional toasts. Everything was handled like a business deal, quick, efficient, and devoid of any romance. John didn't care. To him, 6 months was a short time. But what he didn't anticipate was that from the very first night, Chloe would set boundaries he'd never encountered. She wasn't shy or embarrassed as she entered John's lavish penthouse. Her eyes swept over the expensive art, the fine leather sofas, the bar stocked with premium bottles of wine, none of which impressed her. When John closed the door and turned toward her, Chloe was already standing by the window, looking out at the twinkling lights of the city. 6 months, no more, no less. Her voice rang out, as certain as a declaration. John smiled faintly, removed his tie, and stepped closer. I don't remember objecting to that. Chloe turned back, her deep eyes resting on his face. Good. I want to make sure you understand my limits. We may live under the same roof, but I am not yours to control. For the first time in his life, John Marshall felt like something wasn't going according to plan. He had always been the one calling the shots, but Chloe was laying down the rules from the start. Do you think you can keep that up for 6 months? He asked, his voice defiant. Chloe shrugged. I don't think. I know. John laughed. He had never met anyone like her. The first days of living together, the two were like two people playing a game of tactical chess. John, who was used to being controlling, began testing Chloe's patience. He changed her schedule without warning, arranged lavish parties she didn't want to attend, and even kept her waiting for hours on unnecessary meetings. But every time he thought he was annoying her, Chloe just shrugged and continued on with her life as if his antics didn't affect her. She never argued, never complained. She simply didn't care about the power plays he was trying to impose. And that made John feel more frustrated than anything else. "You thought I was going to get mad and scream?" Chloe once asked when John deliberately kept her waiting for more than 3 hours for a dinner he had no intention of attending. She sat there, calmly holding a cup of hot tea, not showing any sign of losing her composure. John sat across from her, feeling as if he was losing control to someone he never thought he could. "I just thought you would have some sort of reaction," he admitted. Chloe smiled. "I grew up in a family where injustice and control were the order of the day. You can't manipulate me with these cheap tricks, John." John felt as if he had just been dealt a mortal blow. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. Unlike his previous women, who were easily seduced by wealth and power, Chloe needed nothing from him. And that made her the most formidable opponent he had ever met. But John Marshall was not a man to give up his power easily. He began to change tactics. If small manipulations didn't work, then he would use other methods. He deliberately arranged impromptu meetings on Chloe's important days. When she organized an event for her work, he showed up unexpectedly and made himself the center of attention, overshadowing her event. When she refused to attend a party with him, he simply smiled and invited another woman to go with him, causing the media to explode with rumors that their marriage was just a game. But Chloe was undeterred. She continued her work, continued to live the way she wanted, and never gave John a chance to control her. Every time he tried to push her into a corner, she found a way to avoid it without fighting or getting angry. And that made John feel uncomfortable. For the first time, he felt like he was losing something he never thought he would lose: control. One night, when John returned home from a long party, he found Chloe sitting by the window, reading a book. "Aren't you going to sleep?" he asked, taking off his jacket and loosening his tie. Chloe didn't look up. "Do you think I will wait for you?" John smiled. But for some reason he felt a little uneasy. "I think we can talk." Chloe closed the book, set it aside, and looked straight at him. "I am not one of your luxuries, John. You can buy the world, but you cannot buy me." John was silent. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. Chloe stood up and walked quietly back to her room. As the door closed behind her, John realized he had never met a woman like her before. And that made him feel more dangerous than any war he had ever been in. Because this is no longer just a bet. It became a battle that John was not sure he would win. John Marshall has never felt so out of control. All his life, he's been used to being in control of everything: his job, his partners, his women, but Chloe Richards is the exception. Not only does she stand up to his manipulations, she teaches him a lesson in resilience. As the 6 months of marriage continued, John realized that this game was more than just a gamble. He was no longer sure what he was trying to win. If his goal had been to control Chloe, now he was starting to find himself drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. And then, one fateful evening changed everything. It was a rainy night. New York City was drenched in a chilly wind as John entered the penthouse after a long meeting. He tiredly took off his jacket, about to pour himself a glass of wine when his eyes fell on Chloe. She was by the window, the city lights reflecting off her stern face. There was something strange about the way she stood, the way she was too quiet. "Chloe," he called, his voice low. She didn't turn back immediately. After a while, she gently placed the teacup on the table, then turned to look at him. "Have you ever wondered how many people your past actions have affected?" Her voice rang out, not angry, but strangely heavy. John frowned. "What are you talking about?" Chloe walked towards him, each step slow but determined. When she stopped in front of him, her eyes were no longer defiant, but instead filled with deep pain. "Have you ever heard of Richards and Company?" John was momentarily stunned. He had heard of it, a family-owned manufacturing company that had gone bankrupt nearly a decade earlier. But he had never given it much thought, because to him it was just one of hundreds of deals he had won. "Yes, I vaguely remember. A small company that went bankrupt because it couldn't compete," he said, still not understanding Chloe's meaning. She smiled faintly, but there was no joy in her smile. "It's not because I'm not competitive, John. It's because of you. John blinked. I. Chloe nodded, her eyes turning sharp as knives. Don't you remember? You bought out investors, cut off funding, and caused our company to collapse in a matter of months. My father spent his entire life building it, and you only needed a few signatures to destroy it. John felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered his deals. The times he had signed contracts without thinking about the consequences. But it was just a job, just numbers, right? He opened his mouth to say something, but Chloe continued. After the company collapsed, my father tried to find a way to turn things around. He borrowed money, tried to save everything. But then, in the end, he couldn't handle the pressure. Her voice caught in her throat, but she continued to speak. He killed himself, John. He saw no other way out. The room became so quiet that John could hear the rain falling outside the window. He stood there, unable to speak. She knew it all from the start. She entered this marriage not for the game, but for something much bigger. John felt like his world was falling apart. How many lives had he destroyed without even realizing it? How many families had lost everything because of his cold-hearted decisions? Chloe, he whispered, but she shook her head. You don't know, do you? She laughed bitterly. Because you never cared. John felt his chest tighten. He had never felt so weak. He could argue, he could defend himself, but would it help? And then, without another word, Chloe walked past him and into the bedroom, leaving John standing alone in the middle of the large room, where the lavish lighting suddenly became meaningless. That night, John could not sleep. He sat on the chair, looking out at the city still brightly lit, but his heart was filled with darkness. He thought about the past, about the decisions he had made, about the numbers on contracts he never thought could represent someone's life. Chloe has taken his life by storm, and now he realizes she's more than just a strong woman. She's a reflection of all the consequences he's never faced. What can I do now? Is there any chance of fixing it? John didn't know the answer. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was no longer in control. And it was a feeling more terrifying than anything he had ever experienced. John Marshall had never experienced a night like this. His luxurious penthouse seemed colder than ever. The fine wines no longer provided comfort, and the city lights reflected through the glass windows only made him more aware of the emptiness inside. Chloe Richards did what no one else had done before. She made him see himself. Not as a successful millionaire, not as a winner at every game, but as a human being with all his faults and sins piled up. For the first time in his life, John felt remorse. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the penthouse was heavy. Chloe remained calm but distant. She didn't mean to be hostile, nor did she condemn him again. But the silence was the cruelest punishment. John tried to talk to her, but her answers were always short and blunt. He knew that any apology would be meaningless without action. And so, he began to change. No more lavish meetings with business partners. No more deals that only benefited him. John took the time to learn about the families he had inadvertently pushed into poverty. He began to contact the small companies his group had acquired, trying to help them recover. He didn't do it because he wanted instant forgiveness. He did it because it was the right thing to do. Chloe watched it all quietly. At first, she didn't believe that someone like John Marshall could change. But as she watched him devote his time to small businesses and turn down deals that would make him rich at the expense of others, she realized that something was really changing inside him. One evening, when John returned home, he found Chloe sitting on the sofa, a book in her hand. It was a scene that had become familiar to him over the months, but this time there was something different. She is no longer distant. You really are changing, Chloe said, gently closing the book. John stopped, looking at her with rare sincerity in his eyes. I don't know if I can fix it all, but I want to try, he said slowly. Chloe was silent for a moment. Then she sighed softly, a small smile playing on her lips. No one can change completely in just a few months, John. But at least you're trying. John felt a weight lifted from his chest. She might not have completely forgiven him, but at least she had opened a door for him to enter. The final day of the 6-month deal is approaching. John was prepared for Chloe to leave. But instead of packing her bags, she stayed. Not for the money, not out of obligation, but because she, too, realized that their relationship was no longer just a meaningless bet. One morning, when John walked into the kitchen, he saw Chloe making coffee. She was no longer avoiding him like before. When she turned around and placed a cup of coffee on the table for him, John knew this was her answer. They have passed the power game. They have overcome the trauma. Now, they are no longer two people at odds with each other, but two people who are slowly finding something more important, a new beginning. A few months later, Chloe became pregnant. The news came as a shock to both of them. But instead of panic, John felt something he had never felt before, a sense of real responsibility. He used to think he had it all, but only now did he understand that all he had before was just meaningless material things. Chloe looked at him, no longer as a woman punishing him, but as someone giving him a chance to be a better man. "Will you do well?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of worry. John took her hand and squeezed it. "I will do everything to be the person you and the baby can trust." The day they held a small ceremony to welcome the baby, John took Chloe's hand and led her out to the dance floor. Amidst the soft lights and slow music, he held her in his arms, feeling her heartbeat blend with his own. Who would have thought it all started with a bet? Chloe whispered, leaning her head against his chest. John smiled, squeezing her tightly in his arms. "I never thought I would lose any game," he said softly. "But this time, I'm glad I lost." And for the first time in his life, John Marshall understood that the most important victory was not success or money, but love and salvation that he never thought he could find.